19. Christian Apologetics. This was read to the Anglican Carmarthen Conference for Youth Leaders and Junior Clergy at Easter 1945. It was subsequently published in Undeceptions 1971 and later in Compelling Reason 1998. Some of you are priests and some are leaders of youth organizations. I have little right to address either. It is for priests to teach me, not for me to teach them. I have never helped to organize youth, and while I was young myself, I successfully avoided being organized. If I address you, it is in response to a request so urged that I came to regard compliance as a matter of obedience. I am to talk about apologetics. Apologetics means, of course, defense. The first question is, what do you propose to defend? Christianity, of course, and Christianity as understood by the Church in Wales. And here at the outset I must deal with an unpleasant business. It seems to the layman that in the Church of England we often hear from our priests doctrine which is not Anglican Christianity. It may depart from Anglican Christianity in either of two ways. One, it may be so broad or liberal or modern that it in fact excludes any real supernaturalism and thus ceases to be Christian at all. 2. It may, on the other hand, be Roman. It is not, of course, for me to define to you what Anglican Christianity is. I am your pupil, not your teacher. But I insist that wherever you draw the lines, bounding lines must exist, beyond which your doctrine will cease either to be Anglican or to be Christian. And I suggest also that the lines come a great deal sooner than many modern priests think. I think it is your duty to fix the lines clearly in your own minds, and if you wish to go beyond them, you must change your profession. This is your duty not specially as Christians or as priests, but as honest men. There is a danger here of the clergy developing a special professional conscience which obscures the very plain moral issue. Men who have passed beyond these boundary lines in either direction are apt to protest that they have come by their unorthodox opinions honestly. In defense of these opinions, they are prepared to suffer obloquy and to forfeit professional advancement. They thus come to feel like martyrs. But this simply misses the point which so gravely scandalizes the layman. We never doubted that the unorthodox opinions were honestly held. What we complain of is your continuing your ministry after you have come to hold them. We always knew that a man who makes his living as a paid agent of the Conservative Party may honestly change his views and honestly become a communist. What we deny is that he can honestly continue to be a Conservative agent and to receive money from one party while he supports the policy of another. Even when we have thus ruled out teaching which is in direct contradiction to our profession, we must define our task still further. We are to defend Christianity itself, the faith preached by the apostles, attested by the martyrs, embodied in the creeds, expounded by the fathers. This must be clearly distinguished from the whole of what any one of us may think about God and man. Each of us has his individual emphasis. Each holds, in addition to the faith, many opinions which seem to him to be consistent with it and true and important. And so perhaps they are. But as apologists, it is not our business to defend them. We are defending Christianity, not my religion. When we mention our personal opinions, we must always make quite clear the difference between them and the faith itself. St. Paul has given us the model in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25. On a certain point he has no commandment of the Lord, but gives his judgment. No one is left in doubt as to the difference in status implied. This distinction, which is demanded by honesty, also gives the apologist a great tactical advantage. The great difficulty is to get modern audiences to realize that you are preaching Christianity solely and simply because you happen to think it true. They always suppose you are preaching it because you like it, or think it good for society, or something of that sort. Now, a clearly maintained distinction between what the faith actually says and what you would like it to have said, or what you understand, or what you personally find helpful or think probable, forces your audience to realize that you are tied to your data just as the scientist is tied by the results of the experiments, that you are not just saying what you like. This immediately helps them to realize that what is being discussed is a question about objective fact, not gas about ideals and points of view. Secondly, this scrupulous care to preserve the Christian message as something distinct from one's own ideas has one very good effect upon the apologist himself. It forces him, again and again, to face up to those elements in original Christianity which he personally finds obscure or repulsive. He is saved from the temptation to skip or slur or ignore what he finds disagreeable. And the man who yields to that temptation will, of course, never progress in Christian knowledge. For obviously, the doctrines which one finds easy are the doctrines which give Christian sanction to truths you already knew. The new truth, which you do not know and which you need, must, in the very nature of things, be hidden precisely in the doctrines you least like and least understand. It is just the same here as in science. The phenomenon which is troublesome, which doesn't fit in with the current scientific theories, is the phenomenon which compels reconsideration, and thus leads to new knowledge. Science progresses because scientists, instead of running away from such troublesome phenomena or hushing them up, are constantly seeking them out. In the same way, there will be progress in Christian knowledge only as long as we accept the challenge of the difficult or repellent doctrines. A liberal Christianity, which considers itself free to alter the faith whenever the faith looks perplexing or repellent, must be completely stagnant. Progress is made only into a resisting material. From this, there follows a corollary about the apologist's private reading. There are two questions he will naturally ask himself. 1. Have I been keeping abreast of recent movements in theology? 2. Have I stood firm, super monstratus vias, amidst all these winds of doctrine? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14. I want to say emphatically that the second question is far the more important of the two. Our upbringing and the whole atmosphere of the world we live in make it certain that our main temptation will be that of yielding to winds of doctrine, not that of ignoring them. We are not at all likely to be hidebound. We are very likely indeed to be the slaves of fashion. If one has to choose between reading the new books and reading the old, one must choose the old. Not because they are necessarily better, but because they contain precisely those truths of which our own age is neglectful. The standard of permanent Christianity must be kept clear in our minds, and it is against that standard that we must test all contemporary thought. In fact, we must at all costs not move with the times. We serve one who said, "Heaven and earth shall move with the times, but my words shall not move with the times." Matthew chapter 24, verse 35, Mark chapter 13, verse 31, Luke chapter 21, verse 33. I am speaking so far of theological reading. Scientific reading is a different matter. If you know any science, it is very desirable that you should keep it up. We have to answer the current scientific attitude towards Christianity, not the attitude which scientists adopted 100 years ago. Science is in continual change, and we must try to keep abreast of it. For the same reason, we must be very cautious of snatching at any scientific theory which, for the moment, seems to be in our favour. We may mention such things, but we must mention them lightly and without claiming that they are more than interesting. Sentences beginning, "Science has now proved," should be avoided. If we try to base our apologetic on some recent development in science, we shall usually find that just as we have put the finishing touches to our argument, science has changed its mind and quietly withdrawn the theory we have been using as our foundation stone. Timeo Danaeos et dona ferentes is a sound principle. While we are on the subject of science, let me digress for a moment. I believe that any Christian who is qualified to write a good popular book on any science may do much more good by that than by any directly apologetic work. The difficulty we are up against is this. We can make people often attend to the Christian point of view for half an hour or so. But the moment they have gone away from our lecture or laid down our article, they are plunged back into a world where the opposite position is taken for granted. Every newspaper, film, novel, and textbook undermines our work. As long as that situation exists, widespread success is simply impossible. We must attack the enemy's line of communication. What we want is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on other subjects, with their Christianity latent. You can see this most easily if you look at it the other way round. Our faith is not very likely to be shaken by any book on Hinduism. But if, whenever we read an elementary book on geology, botany, politics, or astronomy, we found that its implications were Hindu, that would shake us. It is not the books written in direct defense of materialism that make the modern man a materialist. It is the materialistic assumptions in all the other books. In the same way, it is not books on Christianity that will really trouble him. But he would be troubled if, whenever he wanted a cheap, popular introduction to some science, the best work on the market was always by a Christian. The first step to the reconversion of the country is a series produced by Christians which can beat the Penguins and the Thinkers' Library on their own ground. Its Christianity would have to be latent, not explicit, and, of course, its science perfectly honest. Science twisted in the interests of apologetics would be sin and folly. But I must return to my immediate subject. Our business is to present that which is timeless, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 8, in the particular language of our own age. The bad preacher does exactly the opposite. He takes the ideas of our own age and tricks them out in the traditional language of Christianity. Thus, for example, he may think about the Beveridge Report and talk about the coming of the kingdom. The core of his thought is merely contemporary. Only the superficies is traditional. But your teaching must be timeless at its heart and wear a modern dress. This raises the question of theology and politics. The nearest I can get to a settlement of the frontier problem between them is this: that theology teaches us what ends are desirable and what means are lawful, while politics teaches us what means are effective. Thus theology tells us that every man ought to have a decent wage. Politics tells us by what means this is likely to be attained. Theology tells us which of these means are consistent with justice and charity. On the political question, guidance comes not from revelation, but from natural prudence, knowledge of complicated facts, and ripe experience. If we have these qualifications, we may, of course, state our political opinions. But then we must make it quite clear that we are giving our personal judgment and have no command from the Lord. Not many priests have these qualifications. Most political sermons teach the congregation nothing except what newspapers are taken at the rectory. Our great danger at present is lest the Church should continue to practice a merely missionary technique in what has become a missionary situation. A century ago, our task was to edify those who had been brought up in the faith. Our present task is chiefly to convert and instruct infidels. Great Britain is as much a part of the mission field as China. Now, if you were sent to the Bantus, you would be taught their language and traditions. You need similar teaching about the language and mental habits of your own uneducated and unbelieving fellow countrymen. Many priests are quite ignorant on this subject. What I know about it, I have learned from talking in RAF camps. They were mostly inhabited by Englishmen, and, therefore, some of what I shall say may be irrelevant to the situation in Wales. You will sift out what does not apply. 1. I find that the uneducated Englishman is an almost total skeptic about history. I had expected he would disbelieve the Gospels because they contain miracles, but he really disbelieves them because they deal with things that happened 2,000 years ago. He would disbelieve equally in the Battle of Actium if he heard of it. To those who have had our kind of education, his state of mind is very difficult to realize. To us, the present has always appeared as one section in a huge continuous process. In his mind, the present occupies almost the whole field of vision. Beyond it, isolated from it, and quite unimportant, is something called the old days, a small comic jungle in which highwaymen, Queen Elizabeth, knights in armour, etc. wander about. Then, strangest of all, beyond the old days comes a picture of primitive man. He is science, not history, and is therefore felt to be much more real than the old days. In other words, the prehistoric is much more believed in than the historic. 2. He has a distrust, very rational in the state of his knowledge, of ancient texts. Thus a man has sometimes said to me, "These records were written in the days before printing, weren't they? And you haven't got the original bit of paper, have you?" So what it comes to is that someone wrote something, and someone else copied it, and someone else copied that, and so on. Well, by the time it comes to us, it won't be in the least like the original. This is a difficult objection to deal with, because one cannot, there and then, start teaching the whole science of textual criticism. But at this point their real religion, i.e. faith in science, has come to my aid. The assurance that there is a science called textual criticism, and that its results, not only as regards the New Testament, but as regards ancient texts in general, are generally accepted, will usually be received without objection. I need hardly point out that the word text must not be used, since to your audience it means only a scriptural quotation. 3. A sense of sin is almost totally lacking. Our situation is thus very different from that of the apostles. The pagans, and still more the Metuentes, to whom they preached, were haunted by a sense of guilt, and to them the gospel was, therefore, good news. We address people who have been trained to believe that whatever goes wrong in the world is someone else's fault. The capitalists, the governments, the Nazis, the generals, etc. They approach God himself as his judges. They want to know not whether they can be acquitted for sin, but whether he can be acquitted for creating such a world. In attacking this fatal insensibility, it is useless to direct attention, A, to sins your audience do not commit, or B, to things they do but do not regard as sins. They are usually not drunkards. They are mostly fornicators, but then they do not feel fornication to be wrong. It is, therefore, useless to dwell on either of these subjects. Now that contraceptives have removed the obviously uncharitable element in fornication, I do not myself think we can expect people to recognize it as a sin until they have accepted Christianity as a whole. I cannot offer you a watertight technique for awaking the sense of sin. I can only say that, in my experience, if one begins from the sin that has been one's own chief problem during the last week, one is very often surprised at the way this shaft goes home. But whatever method we use, our continual effort must be to get their minds away from public affairs and crime and bring them down to brass tacks, to the whole network of spite, greed, envy, unfairness, and conceit in the lives of ordinary, decent people like themselves and ourselves. 4. We must learn the language of our audience. And let me say at the outset that it is no use at all laying down a priori what the plain man does or does not understand. You have to find out by experience. Thus, most of us would have supposed that the change from "may truly and indifferently minister justice" to "may truly and impartially" made that place easier to the uneducated. But a priest of my acquaintance discovered his sexton saw no difficulty in "indifferently." "It means making no difference between one man and another," he said, but had no idea what "impartially" meant. On this question of language, the best thing I can do is to make a list of words which are used by people in a sense different from ours. Atonement does not really exist in a spoken modern English, though it would be recognized as a religious word. Insofar as it conveys any meaning to the uneducated, I think it means compensation. No one word will express to them what Christians mean by atonement. You must paraphrase. Being, noun, never means merely entity in popular speech. Often it means what we should call a personal being. E.g., a man said to me, "I believe in the Holy Ghost, but I don't think he is a being." Catholic means papistical. Charity means A. alms, B. a charitable organization, C. much more rarely, indulgence, i.e., a charitable attitude towards a man is conceived as one that denies or condones his sins, not as one that loves the sinner in spite of them. Christian has come to include almost no idea of belief, usually a vague term of approval. The question, "What do you call a Christian?" has been asked of me again and again. The answer they wish to receive is, A Christian is a decent chap who's unselfish, etc. Church means A. Sacred building, B. The clergy. Does not suggest to them the company of all faithful people. Generally used in a bad sense. Direct defence of the church is part of our duty, but use of the word church, where there is no time to defend it, alienates sympathy and should be avoided where possible. Creative now means merely talented, original. The idea of creation in the theological sense is absent from their minds. Creature means beast, irrational animal. Such an expression as, "we are only creatures," would almost certainly be misunderstood. Crucifixion, cross, etc. Centuries of hymnody and religious cant have so exhausted these words that they now very faintly, if at all, convey the idea of execution by torture. It is better to paraphrase, and, for the same reason, to say flogged, for New Testament scourged. Matthew chapter 27, verse 26, Mark chapter 15, verse 15, John chapter 19, verse 1. Dogma, used by the people only in a bad sense to mean unproved assertion delivered in an arrogant manner. Immaculate conception, in the mouth of an uneducated speaker, always means virgin birth. Morality means chastity. Personal. I had argued for at least 10 minutes with a man about the existence of a personal devil, before I discovered that personal meant to him corporeal. I suspect this of being widespread. When they say they don't believe in a personal God, they may often mean only that they are not anthropomorphists. Potential, when used at all, is used in an engineering sense. Never means possible. Primitive means crude, clumsy, unfinished, inefficient. Primitive Christianity would not mean to them at all what it does to you. Sacrifice has no associations with temple and altar. They are familiar with this word only in the journalistic sense. The nation must be prepared for heavy sacrifices. Spiritual means primarily immaterial, incorporeal, but with serious confusions from the Christian uses of pneuma. Hence the idea that whatever is spiritual, in the sense of non-sensuous, is somehow better than anything sensuous. E.g., they don't really believe that envy could be as bad as drunkenness. Vulgarity usually means obscenity or smut. There are bad confusions, and not only in uneducated minds, between A. the obscene or lascivious, what is calculated to provoke lust, B. the indecorous, what offends against good taste or propriety, C. the vulgar proper, what is socially low. Good people tend to think B as sinful as A, with the result that others feel A to be just as innocent as B. To conclude, you must translate every bit of your theology into the vernacular. This is very troublesome, and it means you can say very little in half an hour, but it is essential. It is also of the greatest service to your own thought. I have come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning. A passage from some theological work for translation into the vernacular ought to be a compulsory paper in every ordination examination. I turn now to the question of the actual attack. This may be either emotional or intellectual. If I speak only of the intellectual kind, that is not because I undervalue the other, because, not having been given the gifts necessary for carrying it out, I cannot give advice about it. But I wish to say most emphatically that where a speaker has that gift, the direct evangelical appeal of the come to Jesus type can be as overwhelming today as it was 100 years ago. I have seen it done, preluded by a religious film and accompanied by hymn singing, and with very remarkable effect. I cannot do it, but those who can ought to do it with all their might. I am not sure that the ideal missionary team ought not to consist of one who argues and one who, in the fullest sense of the word, preaches. Put up your arguer first to undermine their intellectual prejudices, then let the evangelist proper launch his appeal. I have seen this done with great success. But here I must concern myself only with the intellectual attack. non omnia possumus omnes. And first, a word of encouragement. Uneducated people are not irrational people. I have found that they will endure and can follow quite a lot of sustained argument if you go slowly. Often, indeed, the novelty of it, for they have seldom met it before, delights them. Do not attempt to water Christianity down. There must be no pretense that you can have it with the supernatural left out. So far as I can see, Christianity is precisely the one religion from which the miraculous cannot be separated. You must frankly argue for supernaturalism from the very outset. The two popular difficulties you will probably have to deal with are these. 1. Now that we know how huge the universe is and how insignificant the earth, it is ridiculous to believe that the universal God should be specially interested in our concerns. In answer to this, you must first correct their error about fact. The insignificance of Earth in relation to the universe is not a modern discovery. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Ptolemy, Almagest, Book 1, Chapter 5, said that in relation to the distance of the fixed stars, Earth must be treated as a mathematical point without magnitude. Secondly, you should point out that Christianity says what God has done for man. It doesn't say, because it doesn't know, what he has or has not done in other parts of the universe. Thirdly, you might recall the parable of the one lost sheep. Matthew chapter 18, verses 11 to 14, Luke chapter 15, verses 4 to 7. If Earth has been specially sought by God, which we don't know, that may not imply that it is the most important thing in the universe, but only that it has strayed. Finally, challenge the whole tendency to identify size and importance. Is an elephant more important than a man, or a man's leg than his brain? 2. People believed in miracles in the old days because they didn't know then that they were contrary to the laws of nature. But they did. If St. Joseph didn't know that a virgin birth was contrary to nature, i.e., if he didn't yet know the normal origin of babies, why, on discovering his wife's pregnancy, was he minded to put her away? Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. Obviously, no event would be recorded as a wonder unless the recorders knew the natural order and saw that this was an exception. If people didn't know that the sun rose in the east, they wouldn't even be interested in its once rising in the west. They were not recorded as a miraculum, nor indeed recorded at all. The very idea of miracle presupposes knowledge of the laws of nature. You can't have the idea of an exception until you have the idea of a rule. It is very difficult to produce arguments on the popular level for the existence of God, and many of the most popular arguments seem to me invalid. Some of these may be produced in discussion by friendly members of the audience. This raises the whole problem of the embarrassing supporter. It is brutal and dangerous to repel him. It is often dishonest to agree with what he says. I usually try to avoid saying anything about the validity of his argument in itself, and reply, "Yes, that may do for you and me, but I'm afraid if we take that line, our friend here on my left might say," etc., etc. Fortunately, though very oddly, I have found that people are usually disposed to hear the divinity of our Lord discussed before going into the existence of God. When I began, I used, if I were giving 2 lectures, to devote the first to mere theism, but I soon gave up this method because it seemed to arouse little interest. The number of clear and determined atheists is apparently not very large. When we come to the incarnation itself, I usually find that some form of the aut deus aut malus homo can be used. The majority of them started with the idea of the great human teacher, who was deified by his superstitious followers. It must be pointed out how very improbable this is among Jews, and how different to anything that happened with Plato, Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad. The Lord's own words and claims, of which many are quite ignorant, must be forced home. The whole case, on a popular level, is very well put indeed in Chesterton's Everlasting Man. Something will usually have to be said about the historicity of the Gospels. You who are trained theologians will be able to do this in ways which I could not. My own line was to say that I was a professional literary critic, and I thought I did know the difference between legend and historical writing. That the Gospels were certainly not legends. In one sense, they're not good enough. And that if they are not history, then they are realistic prose fiction of a kind which actually never existed before the 18th century. Little episodes such as Jesus writing in the dust, John chapter 8 verses 3 to 8, when they brought him the woman taken in adultery, which have no doctrinal significance at all, are the mark. One of the great difficulties is to keep before the audience's mind the question of truth. They always think you are recommending Christianity not because it is true, but because it is good. And in the discussion, they will at every moment try to escape from the issue, true or false, into stuff about a good society, or morals, or the incomes of bishops, or the Spanish Inquisition, or France, or Poland, or anything whatever. You have to keep forcing them back, and again back, to the real point. Only thus will you be able to undermine a. Their belief that a certain amount of religion is desirable, but one mustn't carry it too far. One must keep on pointing out that Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. B. Their firm belief of Article 18. Of course, it should be pointed out that, though all salvation is through Jesus, we need not conclude that he cannot save those who have not explicitly accepted him in this life. And it should, at least in my judgment, be made clear that we are not pronouncing all other religions to be totally false, but rather saying that in Christ whatever is true in all religions is consummated and perfected. But, on the other hand, I think we must attack, wherever we meet it, the nonsensical idea that mutually exclusive propositions about God can both be true. For my own part, I have sometimes told my audience that the only two things really worth considering are Christianity and Hinduism. Islam is only the greatest of the Christian heresies, Buddhism only the greatest of the Hindu heresies, real paganism is dead. All that was best in Judaism and Platonism survives in Christianity. There isn't really, for an adult mind, this infinite variety of religions to consider. We may, salva reverentia, divide religions as we do soups, into thick and clear. By thick, I mean those which have orgies and ecstasies and mysteries and local attachments. Africa is full of thick religions. By clear, I mean those which are philosophical, ethical, and universalizing. Stoicism, Buddhism, and the ethical church are clear religions. And now, if there is a true religion, it must be both thick and clear. For the true God must have made both the child and the man, both the savage and the citizen, both the head and the belly. And the only two religions that fulfill this condition are Hinduism and Christianity. But Hinduism fulfills it imperfectly. A clear religion of the Brahmin hermit in the jungle and the thick religion of the neighboring temple go on side by side. The Brahmin hermit doesn't bother about the temple prostitution, nor the worshipper in the temple about the hermit's metaphysic. But Christianity really breaks down the middle wall of the partition. It takes a convert from Central Africa and tells him to obey an enlightened universalist ethic. It takes a 20th century academic prig like me and tells me to go fasting to a mystery, to drink the blood of the Lord. The savage convert has to be clear, I have to be thick. That is how one knows one has come to the real religion. One last word. I have found that nothing is more dangerous to one's own faith than the work of an apologist. No doctrine of that faith seems to me so spectral, so unreal, as one that I have just successfully defended in a public debate. For a moment, you see, it has seemed to rest on oneself. As a result, when you go away from that debate, it seems no stronger than that weak pillar. That is why we apologists take our lives in our hands and can be saved only by falling back continually from the web of our own arguments, as from our intellectual counters, into the reality, from Christian apologetics into Christ himself. That also is why we need one another's continual help. Oremus pro invicem. 17. Myth became fact. This essay first appeared in World Dominion, Volume 22, September-October 1944, and was reproduced in Undeceptions 1971. It is now in Guard in the Dock 1998. My friend Quirinius has advanced the charge that none of us are in fact Christians at all. According to him, historic Christianity is something so barbarous that no modern man can really believe it. The moderns who claim to do so are in fact believing a modern system of thought which retains the vocabulary of Christianity and exploits the emotions inherited from it while quietly dropping its essential doctrines. Quirinius compared modern Christianity with the modern English monarchy. The forms of kingship have been retained, but the reality has been abandoned. All this I believe to be false, except of a few modernist theologians who, by God's grace, become fewer every day. But for the moment, let us assume that Quirinius is right. Let us pretend, for purposes of argument, that all who now call themselves Christians have abandoned the historic doctrines. Let us suppose that modern Christianity reveals a system of names, rituals, formulae, and metaphors which persists although the thoughts behind it have changed. Quirinius ought to be able to explain the persistence. Why, on his view, do all these educated and enlightened pseudo-Christians insist on expressing their deepest thoughts in terms of an archaic mythology which must hamper and embarrass them at every turn? Why do they refuse to cut the umbilical cord which binds the living and flourishing child to its moribund mother? For if Quirinius is right, it should be a great relief to them to do so. Yet the odd thing is that even those who seem most embarrassed by the sediment of barbaric Christianity in their thought become suddenly obstinate when you ask them to get rid of it altogether. They will strain the cord almost to breaking point, but they refuse to cut it. Sometimes they will take every step except the last one. If all who professed Christianity were clergymen, it would be easy, though uncharitable, to reply that their livelihood depends on not taking that last step. Yet even if this were the true cause of their behaviour, even if all clergymen are intellectual prostitutes who preach for pay, and usually starvation pay, what they secretly believe to be false, surely so widespread a darkening of conscience among thousands of men not otherwise known to be criminal itself demands explanation. And, of course, the profession of Christianity is not confined to the clergy. It is professed by millions of lay men and women who earn thereby contempt, unpopularity, suspicion, and the hostility of their own families. How does this come to happen? Obstinacies of this sort are interesting. Why not cut the cord, asks Quirinius. Everything would be much easier if you would free your thought from this vestigial mythology. To be sure, far easier. Life would be far easier for the mother of an invalid child if she put it into an institution, and adopted someone else's healthy baby instead. Life would be far easier to many a man if he abandoned the woman he has actually fallen in love with and married someone else because she is more suitable. The only defect of the healthy baby and the suitable woman is that they leave out the patient's only reason for bothering about a child or wife at all. Would not conversation be much more rational than dancing? Said Jane Austen's Miss Bingley. Much more rational, replied Mr. Bingley, but much less like a ball. In the same way, it would be much more rational to abolish the English monarchy. But how if, by doing so, you leave out the one element in our state which matters most? How if the monarchy is the channel through which all the vital elements of citizenship, loyalty, the consecration of secular life, the hierarchical principle, splendour, ceremony, continuity, still trickle down to irrigate the dust bowl of modern economic statecraft? The real answer of even the most modernist Christianity to Quirinius is the same. Even assuming, which I most constantly deny, that the doctrines of historic Christianity are merely mythical, it is the myth which is the vital and nourishing element in the whole concern. Quirinius wants us to move with the times. Now, we know where times move. They move away. But in religion we find something that does not move away. It is what Quirinius calls the myth that abides. It is what he calls the modern and living thought that moves away. Not only the thought of theologians, but the thought of anti-theologians. Where are the predecessors of Quirinius? Where is the Epicureanism of Lucretius? The pagan revival of Julian the Apostate? Where are the Gnostics? Where is the monism of Averroes, the deism of Voltaire, the dogmatic materialism of the great Victorians? They have moved with the times. But the thing they were all attacking remains. Quirinius finds it still there to attack. The myth, to speak his language, has outlived the thoughts of all its defenders and all of its adversaries. It is the myth that gives life. Those elements even in modernist Christianity which Quirinius regards as vestigial are the substance. What he takes for the real modern belief is the shadow. To explain this, we must look a little closer at myth in general, and at this myth in particular. Human intellect is incurably abstract. Pure mathematics is the type of successful thought. Yet the only realities we experience are concrete: this pain, this pleasure, this dog, this man. While we are loving the man, bearing the pain, enjoying the pleasure, we are not intellectually apprehending pleasure, pain, or personality. When we begin to do so, on the other hand, the concrete realities sink to the level of mere instances or examples. We are no longer dealing with them, but with that which they exemplify. This is our dilemma: either to taste and not to know, or to know and not to taste. Or more strictly, to lack one kind of knowledge because we are in an experience, or to lack another kind because we are outside it. As thinkers, we are cut off from what we think about. As tasting, touching, willing, loving, hating, we do not clearly understand. The more lucidly we think, the more we are cut off. The more deeply we enter into reality, the less we can think. You cannot study pleasure in the moment of the nuptial embrace, nor repentance while repenting, nor analyze the nature of humour while roaring with laughter. But when else can you really know these things? If only my toothache would stop, I could write another chapter about pain. But once it stops, what do I know about pain? Of this tragic dilemma, myth is the partial solution. In the enjoyment of a great myth, we come nearest to experiencing as a concrete what can otherwise be understood only as an abstraction. At this moment, for example, I am trying to understand something very abstract indeed, the fading, vanishing of tasted reality as we try to grasp it with the discursive reason. Probably I have made heavy weather of it. But if I remind you instead of Orpheus and Eurydice, how he was suffered to lead her by the hand, but, when he turned round to look at her, she disappeared. What was merely a principle becomes imaginable. You may reply that you never till this moment attached that meaning to that myth. Of course not. You are not looking for an abstract meaning at all. If that was what you were doing, the myth would be for you no true myth, but a mere allegory. You were not knowing, but tasting. But what you were tasting turns out to be a universal principle. The moment we state this principle, we are admittedly back in the world of abstraction. It is only while receiving the myth as a story that you experience the principle concretely. When we translate, we get abstraction, or rather dozens of abstractions. What flows into you from the myth is not truth, but reality. Truth is always about something, but reality is that about which truth is, and, therefore, every myth becomes the father of innumerable truths on the abstract level. Myth is the mountain whence all the different streams arise which become truths down here in the valley. In hac valle abstractionis. Or, if you prefer, myth is the isthmus which connects the peninsular world of thought with that vast continent we really belong to. It is not, like truth, abstract, nor is it, like direct experience, bound to the particular. Now, as myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. The heart of Christianity is a myth which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be a myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens, at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris, dying nobody knows when or where, to a historical person crucified, it is all in order, under Pontius Pilate. By becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is the miracle. I suspect that men have sometimes derived more spiritual sustenance from myths they did not believe than from the religion they professed. To be truly Christian, we must both assent to the historical fact and also receive the myth, a fact though it has become, with the same imaginative embrace which we accord to all myths. The one is hardly more necessary than the other. A man who disbelieved the Christian story as fact, but continually fed on it as myth, would, perhaps, be more spiritually alive than one who assented and did not think much about it. The modernist, the extreme modernist, infidel in all but name, need not be called a fool or hypocrite because he obstinately retains, even in the midst of his intellectual atheism, the language, rites, sacraments, and story of the Christians. The poor man may be clinging, with a wisdom he himself by no means understands, to that which is his life. It would have been better that Loisy should have remained a Christian. It would not necessarily have been better that he should have purged his thought of vestigial Christianity. Those who do not know that this great myth became fact when the Virgin conceived are, indeed, to be pitied. But Christians also need to be reminded, we may thank Quirinius for reminding us, that what became fact was a myth, that it carries with it into the world of fact all the properties of a myth. God is more than a god, not less. Christ is more than Balder, not less. We must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting on our theology. We must not be nervous about parallels and pagan Christs. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. If God chooses to be mythopoeic, and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and delight, addressed to the savage, the child, and the poet in each one of us, no less than to the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher.